What does it mean to understand something? That's the question I've spent most of my life asking, not philosophically, but physically. As in, if I can describe the geometry of a thing, map its resonance frequencies, reduce its behavior to a workable equation, do I then have the right to use it? My name is Sujata Dey-Corrigan, Master Temporal Mechanic, licensed by the Colonial Authority of Calcutta Station, planet Varath, in the 607th year of human settlement on this world, and I'm going to tell you about the worst thing I ever built. But first, let me tell you what it looked like from inside, because from inside, it looked like genius. The Chrono Atelier occupied the top 3 floors of the station's oldest copper frame building, and on the morning this story truly begins, it smelled the way it always smelled: heated mineral resin, machine oil, and that faint metallic sweetness that the temporal crystals give off when they're under load. I've heard colonists who grew up elsewhere describe the smell of Varathi crystal resonance as unpleasant. I've always found it beautiful. That, I think, was my first problem. Varath doesn't look like much from a ship's viewport. A warm amber gold ball striped with crystal planes, twin suns making the whole surface gleam like the inside of a pocket watch. But the planet's sky, once you're on the ground, is something else. Deep violet at the zenith. The wheel, our name for the debris ring around the single moon, refracting both suns' light even in the middle of the night, so that actual darkness never quite arrives. The colonial architects designed everything with brass and copper, and the ring light makes those metals glow silver at the edges. Calcutta Station at 3 in the morning looks like a city made of embers. I loved it. I've always loved it. That's important, because loving the place is not the same as understanding it, and I made the catastrophic mistake of believing those two things were equivalent. The Grand Chronometer project had been mine for 7 years. The mathematics were, I genuinely believed, elegant. Varath produces what we call temporal eddies, localized zones where time moves at fractionally different rates, a consequence of the planet's irregular rotation and its bizarre internal crystal structure. For 6 centuries, colonists had suffered the effects. Displacement events where a person might step through a doorway and arrive 12 seconds before or after they should have. Lost tools, clocks that disagreed with each other, the peculiar madness that accumulated if you lived near a strong eddy for too long. My solution was this. If you could create a sufficient resonance grid using Varathi temporal crystals, properly calibrated, properly aligned, you could produce a dampening field across the entire settlement. The Grand Chronometer wouldn't just tell time, it would manage time, smooth out the eddies, protect 300,000 colonists from 6 centuries of low-grade temporal poisoning. The math worked. I'd run it 600 times. The warp geometry of the resonance field was sound. The only thing I hadn't adequately considered was where the crystals came from. Pel Voigt, my apprentice, was 19 and had been with me for 3 years. Good hands, better instincts than I'd given him credit for. That morning, he was cleaning the phase lock calibrator when he said, without looking up, "Gavel was doing the thing again last night."
Standing facing the south wall for about 4 hours. I checked the logs. It wasn't in a recharge cycle. It wasn't running diagnostics. It was just standing there.
I told him Gavel was fine. Automata with resonance cores often developed what I called orientation behaviors, a kind of algorithmic stillness when processing loads spiked. I'd written a paper on it. I believed the paper. Gavel, Galvanic Articulated Verification and Enumeration Locus, was my greatest personal engineering achievement and the project I was most proud of separate from the chronometer itself. 11 years of construction, brass casing, precision clockwork musculature, and at its center, a Varathi temporal resonance core I'd extracted from a damaged crystal formation in the outer plains 12 years ago. The core had appeared inert when I found it. I'd assumed inert meant dead. I hadn't yet considered that for a living system, there might be a difference between those words. Gavel was 1.6 meters of articulated brass, and it had a voice like a well-tuned pipe organ, warm, precise, faintly resonant in ways that shouldn't have been mechanically possible, but that I'd always attributed to acoustic quirks of the casing. It maintained the atelier. It tracked my supply inventories. It asked me questions I found charming in their specificity.
I have no appointment listed. Who is waiting?
Adjust the sequence, gavel, and log the deficit. The visitor arrived at 8:10 in the morning, which was the hour the outer ring's bioluminescent street lanterns dimmed to daytime glow, and the twin suns properly cleared the crystal plains to the east. I heard the door chime. Pell went to answer it. He came back with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. Careful, as though he was carrying something breakable.
It's a Varathi elder, Suja. She says she has an appointment. She's been waiting since 7.
I hadn't made any such appointment. But when I went to the front room, I understood why Pell looked the way he did. She was old, or what old looks like among the Varathi, which is different from human age. Her crystal deposits had gone from their usual amber shifting tone to deep indigo, which I later learned was the color of accumulated years among her kind. She wore obsidian black robes with crystal conduit channels running along the sleeves, and an amulet at her throat carved with a symbol I didn't recognize then. 2 hands, neither above the other. She was calm in the way that large, old things are calm. Not peaceful, but settled. She told me her name was Terry, that she was the keeper of the Undercroft, and that she had come to ask me, politely and in advance, to stop what I was doing.
I have come as a courtesy, architect. What you are building above the Undercroft is causing what your kind calls interference and...
I sat with that for a moment. The word screaming didn't fit the physics I knew. It didn't fit anything in my 7 years of project documentation. I told her, as carefully and respectfully as I could, that the resonance effects of the chronometer's construction phase were well within modeled parameters, that I was aware of the dampening effect on the surrounding crystal structures, and that the project would be complete within the month.
Using instruments built for the things you operate. Your instruments cannot measure what they are built to have. Trust your kings to yourself.
I thanked her for her concern. I showed her to the door. I should have sat with that longer. The math was sound. The math was always sound. I went back to my crystals. It was 3 hours later, while Pell and I were running a phase lock test on the 2 crystals mounted in the atelier's rigs, that it happened. The calibrator stuttered. Then Gavel, who had been cataloging component specs at its station across the room, went still. Not still the way machines go still when processing, still the way things go still when they hear something. And then Gavel spoke. Not in Standard, not in any of the 11 colonial languages I'd programmed it with. Gavel spoke in Old Varathi, the tonal language of the Undercroft inscriptions, which I recognized from my research, but had never heard spoken aloud by anything living. Pell and I stared at each other across the workbench. I asked Gavel what it had just said. There was a long pause, longer than any processing delay I'd ever logged from it, and then Gavel said, in Standard, in its usual voice,
What I said. Architect, I do not know where those words came from. I have no record of generating that output.
a machine built by human hands, with a resonance core I'd thought was dead. It had no record of generating those words, but those words had come from somewhere. Every major engineering problem I've ever worked on has a moment, a specific, identifiable moment when the data begins telling you something your theory didn't predict. The competent response is to update the theory, The response I actually gave, consistently and with great confidence, was to look for errors in the data. The 3 days after Gavel's episode were instructive. That's the word I'd use now. At the time, I used the word anomalous, which is scientific language for, I don't have a framework for this yet, but I will. The temporal drift events started small. A wrench that I'd set down at 11 in the morning was logged by Gavel as having been picked up at 10:58. A cup of resin compound appeared on a shelf where it hadn't been, and then vanished. My pocket chronometer, calibrated to 6 decimal places, began disagreeing with itself by fractions of seconds that grew daily. Always worse near Gavel's charging bay. Always worse at night. My first diagnosis: resonance feedback from the chronometer tower's construction activity, amplified by the 2 test crystals in my rigs. Solvable. I ran new equations. I was excited, genuinely excited. This was the kind of problem I lived for. A new variable I hadn't modeled. The solution I tried: a dampening coil around each crystal rig, designed to absorb excess resonance before it could cascade. Pell helped me install it over a 12-hour session. We activated it the next morning. The drift events doubled. Every clock in the atelier began running at different rates, some fast, some slow, one backward. The wrench that had been displaced by 2 minutes the day before was now displaced by 11. I found a page of my own notes in my handwriting that I had no memory of writing.
Suja, I want to ask something and I need you to actually think about it before you answer. What if we're not fixing the drift? What if we're causing it?
I told him the dampening coil needed recalibration. He gave me a look I didn't understand then. I understand it now. He was watching someone choose the wrong answer in real time and calculate whether it was worth the argument. Pell had suggested twice in the past year that we visit the undercroft before completing the chronometer. Study what was down there before we installed the last crystals. I'd said we had survey data. I'd said the survey data was sufficient. I'd said going down there was politically complicated given the tensions with the Varathi Council, and I didn't want to jeopardize the project's approval status. All of that was true. None of it was the real reason. The real reason was that I didn't want to see what I'd been taking from. The cascade event on the 4th day changed my calculations. A displacement event so severe that the clock on my workshop wall cycled backward 40 minutes before stopping. Gavel stood motionless for 6 hours, and when it came back online, it looked at me with its amber optical sensors, the same amber as a Varathi's eyes, a coincidence I'd never thought about before, and said, an automaton that should not be able to hear anything below the range of its mechanical audio pickups, telling me it could hear something beneath us, using the word distress. I went down. The undercroft is 300 meters below the station's surface, accessible through a lift installed by colonists 2 centuries ago, which the Varathi had never protested because they apparently didn't need it. They had their own routes through passages colonists had never mapped. The lift itself rattled and smelled of old cable grease, and Pell stood beside me without speaking for the full descent. What met us at the bottom? I don't have adequate engineering language for it. That was my first sign that I was somewhere my frameworks didn't reach. The undercroft was vast. Not room-scale vast, city-scale vast. Chambers carved from obsidian that stretched beyond the range of our lanterns, lit from within by natural crystal formations that pulsed with slow, deep, bioluminescent light, cyan and indigo cycling in long, rhythmic waves. Like breathing, the air moved in those same long, slow pulses. The temperature was constant and wrong in the way that living things are constant. It didn't fluctuate because the environment was stable. It didn't fluctuate because something was maintaining it. And running through the center of every visible chamber, the temporal arrays. Not the fragments I'd been collecting from the surface planes, the original structures. Still intact, crystal formations the size of city blocks, interconnected by filaments of living crystal tissue, pulsing with the same rhythm as the bioluminescent light, the same rhythm as the air. I recognized the pattern. I'd seen it in smaller scale, extracted, fragmented, dead. Pell said nothing. He was looking at the array formations and then looking at me, waiting for me to say it. It wasn't a resource. It wasn't a geological feature. It was a system, a living, self-regulating temporal consciousness distributed through the crystal structure of the entire planet. The eddies I'd been trying to fix weren't flaws in Varath's physics. They were breathing. The planet breathed through its temporal arrays, and the temporal crystals I'd been extracting for 7 years? Organs. Each one. Terry was there. I hadn't expected her, but she'd been waiting. She stood beside an intact formation twice my height, one 7-fingered hand resting against it, the crystal's pulse visible through her palm. I didn't know what to say. I've never not known what to say in a technical situation. The math was supposed to tell me what to say.
I saw it.
I shook my head.
And how is this possible?
It simply is, Sujata.
The machine you built.
7 years, dozens of crystals, and I'd called it a project. I did something in the days after the Undercroft that I've had to think very hard about since. I went back to the atelier. I sat at my desk, and I opened a new set of equations. Because here's the thing about being someone who solves problems for a living. The only tool you have is problem solving. And my mind, which had spent decades treating impossible situations as engineering challenges, could not stop. Even with the Undercroft still in my eyes, even with Gavel's grief in my ears, my mind went, okay, new constraints, new problem, new solution. I told myself I could redesign the chronometer to work with the living system, reduce the crystal count, use only formation edge fragments that had naturally separated from the main arrays, rather than extracted cores, route the resonance field to amplify the planet's existing temporal breathing rather than override it. The math, I convinced myself, still worked, just new math, better math, math that admitted what I now knew. This is what the protagonist is wrong looks like from inside. It looks like progress. It looks like learning. I was so proud of that redesign. I went to Praetor Farquhar with it the following morning.
The equations are new. I've run the numbers. You have to understand.
Oswin Farquhar was a large man in the way that colonial administrators often become large. Not physically, but spatially. He occupied rooms entirely, made them his. His office in the Civic Assembly Hall had windows that looked directly at the half-built chronometer tower, and he stood at those windows while I presented the redesigned specifications.
The Undercroft reduced to a talking point.
I told him 30% reduction still dampened 87% of the eddy events. I told him the living system consideration was a genuine constraint that the project design hadn't accounted for. I told him, he didn't say, finish it or else. He didn't need to. He put his hand on my shoulder and said,
And the hum is wrong.
One afternoon in a cave.
Power to 60%. Initiate phase 2.
Pell quit that afternoon. Not dramatically. He packed his tools into his bag, and he stood at the atelier door and he said,
I think if you were going to stop, you'd have stopped by now. I'm not going to watch the rest of this, Suja. I'm sorry.
I told him I understood. And then I went back to the redesigned equations that were, I now suspected, still wrong, and I worked through the night because that's what I do. That's all I knew how to do. Gavel went silent for 36 hours. Not offline. Its lights were on, its systems showed active, but it didn't speak. It stood in the center of the atelier floor and faced south, which was the direction of the undercroft, and the harmonic hum it had always made, the one I'd found pleasant, had changed key. Lower, more dissonant, wrong. The preliminary test was scheduled for 4 in the afternoon. I ran it myself, with a skeleton crew of 3 technicians who didn't know what I now knew. The chronometer tower was only 60% powered. A partial test, just the resonance field initialization. I told myself it would be contained. I told myself the new equations held. They didn't hold for 4 seconds. The resonance cascade began as a shimmer, the kind of visual distortion you get when a strong eddy passes through a space. I'd seen it 100 times, but this shimmer didn't pass. It built. The chronometer's partial field grabbed every crystal in its radius, the ones in the tower, the ones in my rigs upstairs, the ones in every colonial device within 500 meters, and it hit the living system of the undercroft like a frequency weapon. Varath screamed back. For 6 minutes, every person in Calcutta Station experienced a temporal eddy of a magnitude the colony had never recorded. 6 minutes of overlapping time. I heard later what people saw, moments from their future projected onto the present, arguments that hadn't happened, faces of people not yet born, and some, the ones who lived near strong eddies, who'd already accumulated eddy exposure, saw things that hadn't happened and never would, because their temporal perception had been permanently fractured. I was inside the atelier when it hit. I saw nothing. My eddy dampener held. But what I saw, what I watched with completely clear eyes while the world outside warped, was Gavel. Gavel moved to the center of the room. Its optical sensors found me. And then, with precise, deliberate movements, as though it had been planning this, it opened its own chest cavity. The locks it had never engaged before, the panels I'd never had reason to open. It reached inside, found the resonance core, the one I'd installed, the one I thought was dead, and it pulled it free. The core came out glowing. Not the neutral glow of an active power source, the deep cyan indigo pulse of the undercroft, of the living arrays, of something that had been alive this whole time, inside my machine, separated from its system, maintained in isolation by the only means available to it, the machine I'd built around it. Gavel set the core gently on the workbench, and then it collapsed. The core pulsed once. The cascade outside began, slowly, to ease. I sat on the floor of my atelier, in a city that had just experienced 6 minutes of fractured time, next to my collapsed automaton, looking at a glowing crystal that had been alive for 12 years inside a machine I'd built to catalog my supply inventories. I had been so very proud of that machine. The hours after the cascade were very clear. That's one of the things I remember most, how clear everything was. The station's eddy dampeners had all burned out, which meant the natural eddies were back in full force. But somehow, I couldn't feel disoriented. Maybe I'd simply run out of room for disorientation. There's a stillness on the other side of catastrophic failure that I'd never experienced before. No more equations to run, no more variables to test, just the floor under me and the fact of what I'd done. Terry arrived at the atelier 40 minutes after the cascade. She didn't knock. She came in the way she'd come in the first time, like someone who had been here before, in the way that meant centuries of watching, not years of visiting. She looked at Gavel's collapsed form. She looked at the core on the workbench. She looked at me. I asked her what we needed to do. She brought me back to the Undercroft, and she showed me what 6 minutes of resonance cascade had done to the living arrays. Fractures I couldn't see from the surface, temporal filaments severed, crystal formations that had been pulsing with the planet's slow breath, now dark and still. A section of the central array the size of a city block had gone completely silent. She showed me the damage, and then she showed me something else, the Varath ritual. The same symbol from her amulet, 2 hands, neither above the other. A process for returning extracted crystals to the living system. Not reinstalling them like components, returning them, like reattaching severed tissue. It would require the core from Gavel's chest. It would require every crystal I'd installed in my test rigs. It would require the partial framework of the chronometer tower to be dismantled and the crystals within it returned in sequence. It would also, as a side effect, completely destroy 7 years of my work and terminate the Grand Chronometer project permanently. She needed me for the dismantling. I thought about Farquhar. I thought about my commission. I thought about the 7 years of documentation I'd filed with the Colonial Authority, and the 2 papers I'd published, and the reputation I'd spent my entire adult life constructing, one precise measurement at a time. I thought about Gavel, lying on the floor of my atelier, opened up, having given the only thing it had that could stop what I'd started. I thought about what Gavel had said to me when it removed its own core, what it had been trying to tell me for 11 years in the only language I might eventually understand. Tell me what order to remove them. The Varath ritual took 3 days. Terry and I worked in 12-hour sessions, she guiding the reattachment of each crystal to the living filament network, me handling the mechanical extraction from the colonial devices. It was the most technically demanding work I'd ever done, and the first work I'd done in 7 years that didn't feel like engineering. It felt like surgery, like trying to be careful, like being responsible for something I hadn't made and didn't own. Hell came back on the 2nd day. He didn't say anything about having left. He just picked up a wrench and started helping with the chronometer tower's lower framework, and that was enough. The core from Gavel's chest was the last piece. Terry handled it. She took it from me with both hands, the 2 hands neither above the other gesture, and she placed it against the fracture in the central array where the cascade had been worst. The crystal pulse that spread outward from that point was unlike anything I'd measured in 7 years of working with Varathi crystals. It moved through the Undercroft in a slow wave, and where it passed, the darkened formations lit again. Not the frantic brightness of a machine under load, but the deep, patient pulse of something breathing. Varath breathing. Farquhar stripped my commission the day the chronometer tower came down. The Colonial Authority suspended my license pending a full review of project methodology. Councillor Ashvale, who had been saying for 2 years that the project violated the spirit of the Colonial Compact, moved to have the relevant treaty provisions amended. I gave my testimony, all of it. The survey data, the extraction logs, the cascade event records. I didn't minimize anything. The atelier was quiet for a long time after that. I didn't build anything for almost a year. That was the hardest part, if I'm honest. Harder than the commission loss, harder than the review. Not building. My hands kept reaching for tools and then stopping. The equations kept starting themselves in my head and I kept shutting them down. Not because the problem stopped being interesting, because I was learning, very slowly, the difference between I want to understand this and I have the right to touch this. Terry came to the atelier 4 months after the cascade. She brought 3 Varathi students, young ones, their crystal deposits still amber, still shifting rapidly with everything they felt. She asked if I'd be willing to teach them mechanical resonance calibration. The techniques I'd developed for working with temporal crystals, the ones that had caused so much damage, had, it turned out, some legitimate applications for maintaining the living system's interface with colonial equipment. Done correctly, done carefully, done with the Varathi, not instead of them. I said yes. Then I said, I need to be very clear that most of what I know is what not to do. I think about Gavel a lot. The colonial authority classified the automaton as damaged beyond repair after the cascade. The chassis without a resonance core was just brass and clockwork, and they were right that it couldn't be restarted. But the core itself... Terry tells me it's still there, in the central array, still connected to the living filament network, still pulsing. She says the Varathi students who meditate near that section of the array sometimes hear it, a warm, slightly mechanical hum. Not distressed anymore, not trying to communicate through a framework that was never designed for the purpose, just there. Just part of the thing it was always part of, before I took it out. So, what does it mean to understand something? I used to think understanding meant mastery. Map the geometry, solve the equation, build the device. If I could describe a thing precisely enough, it was mine to use. I know differently now. Understanding, it turns out, starts at the point where you realize the thing you're studying has its own agenda, its own purposes, its own language that you don't speak yet and may never fully speak, and that this is not a problem to solve. It's a relationship to build. The wheel still glows at night over Calcutta Station. The ring light still catches the copper and brass at the edges and makes everything look like it's made of embers. The temporal eddies still happen. I feel them now in a way I didn't before the cascade changed something in my perception. A slight displacement, a moment where the present blurs at its edges. The Varathi tell me this sensation over time becomes as natural as breathing. I'm learning. Late, and badly, and with the specific humility of someone who had to break something irreplaceable before she understood why she shouldn't have been touching it in the first place. But I'm learning. And Varath breathes on.